How's it going, everyone? My name is Jake, and this is going to be the start of a new exciting series where I talk about and demonstrate modern mixing techniques to help you guys create better, more detailed mixes. These videos will be short, sweet, and organized. We will talk about what these techniques are, when to use them, and how it's done. So if you're looking to add more tricks to your arsenal, you're in the right place. Let's get into it. All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at snare reverb. Now, what is snare reverb? So essentially, what snare reverb is you're aiming to bring out the sustain of the snare, give it more pop and more character. Usually, what I tend to do is add plate reverbs, look through plate reverbs, because what a plate reverb does is essentially accentuates the sustain, gives it a nice, long, clear sustain, and also helps with the brightness and accentuates that high end, which just seems to work really well with the snare drum. Now, something to take note of is when you're adding snare reverb, you're not really looking to add room noise as if you were, you're adding a room reverb to the whole mix. You're really just trying to accentuate the character of the snare. You're trying to make the snare sound wider, really just increase the amount of pop and sonic image that the snare has. So when should you use it? So snare sounds are all over the board. Some are weak, thin, and some have a lot of tones, and some just have crazy amounts of sustain. So like I said, reverb is used to kind of give it more power. I wouldn't necessarily always use a snare reverb, although I tend to find that it really helps, and you just really lower the amount of reverb that's coming through, depending on how well the snare was recorded, how much sustain the snare has, so on and so forth. So it's not necessary all the time, but I'd say probably about 80% of the time I find myself wanting to add a little bit of snare reverb, even if it's just a little bit. All right, so let's look at how we put a reverb on the snare and how to kind of mold it to really increase the character and pop of a snare drum. Now, as you see, I already have a snare and a snare reverb track set up, and I have the snare being sent over at 0 dB over to our snare reverb. So let's take a listen to what we have before we add any reverb. So it sounds, sounds okay. It sounds a little flat, doesn't have enough width to it. Can definitely bring out more of the snare sound, and that's what we're going to aim to do here with our snare reverb. Now, obviously our first task here will be to bring up our reverb plugin and kind of set our decay time. Now, this isn't true for every time you set a reverb, but I find it particularly helpful when you're adding a reverb to any drums, really, you want to make sure that the decay is synchronized with your tempo of the song so that each hit syncs up with the rhythm in general, and it really helps to kind of make the reverb fit better. So how do we do this? Let's pull up our calculator. It's a pretty easy equation. Now it's 60,000, which is how many milliseconds are in a minute, I believe, and you want to divide that by the tempo, which in this case is 124. So we have around 484 milliseconds. Now it's any multiple of that will work, so I'm actually going to bring this up to, I think, 968, 484 times 2. All right. Not going to go to 968 for me. Anyways, so yeah, 967, that's pretty close. And let's take a look at what we have for plate reverbs. I think, let's see what the small plate sounds like. Bring this back up to 968. I'm going to bring this all the way up. All right, so I think that's we can work with that. I hear a lot of low end, but we'll fix this up here in a second. I'm just going to bring it down a little bit. Now, the next step that I want to do, now that we just have like a very general setting of our reverb, is we want to add some EQ. Now, the reason we want to do this is we want to essentially shape the reverb sound to fit the snare and not kind of overwhelm the snare too much. Now, we can really be quite aggressive because this snare is only affecting what's being sent over to the snare reverb track. And you want to make sure that it's before the reverb so that it's hitting, so that the signal is hitting this EQ before it's hitting the reverb. So the first thing I want to do is, I know we have a lot of low end. It's kind of just adding boominess and muddiness to it. Take out some of that. Not too much. We still want some of the thickness that the low end provides. Awesome. Now we also want to take out a little bit of high end. We don't want it to be too bright. We don't want the reverb really overwhelming the snare, as I said, so bring this back. Now there's also a couple of frequencies in there that I'm hearing. A little bit of boxiness and a little bit of weird high-end tonal stuff going on. So we're going to do some sweeps here to see if we can take out of that and make it more clear. Right away. There's a bit of our boxiness. Awesome. So that really just kind of clears it up, takes out some of the stuff that we really don't want, and kind of mold the reverb into the natural sound of the snare. So let's take a listen again. Without it. Really just helps to mold the reverb to the snare. So that's essentially what you want to think about while you're adding an EQ to your snare reverb. Let's go back over to our reverb plugin here. Now I want to add some pre-delay, and essentially what pre-delay does is it adds a little bit of time in between the initial sound of the snare and the onset of early reflections. And this just helps to give the snare reverb a little bit of space from the actual reverb and kind of separates them and kind of clears it up a little bit. Now we also want to set this to synchronize with our tempo. So thinking, what was it, 460? No, I don't want it to be too long. So I think I want to divide it by 4 into 4s here. So 484 divided by 4 would be like 12. Yeah, around 12 milliseconds. So there we go. Let's see how that sounds. Cool. Add just a little bit of width here. Now we're going to dial this back and kind of start thinking about where it's actually going to sit in the mix. I That sounds pretty nice. And I think the last thing that we want to do here is we're going to add a little bit of compression. And the reason for this is we want to kind of increase that sustain of the reverb. So I'm going to pull up our virtual mix rack, bring out a compressor here. And essentially what we want to do is we want to slow up our attack time, and we want it to not affect the transient. We just want to affect the sustain of the reverb. And with the release, what we want to do is essentially make sure that when the snare reverb ends, that it's before the next hit of the snare, so that they don't kind of muddy each other out. We still want it to be clear, and this just helps it kind of make it sound more natural. Because as I said several times now, that we really just want to make sure that we're just adding character to the snare and not adding an actual room sound to the snare. Maybe add a little bit more here. There we go. Let's bring this down a little bit more. So let's hear without it. It just sounds flat. Really helps to bring it out. Really helps to bring out that snare and make it sound more lively, if that's the right word for it. Anyways, this is how I go about adding my snare reverb. Hopefully you guys picked up something. Stay tuned for many more of these episodes. Till then, have a good one.